And so he's here in Midian where he sees the fire, and he's told to go back into Egypt to get the Israelites out. And so he said to Pharaoh, he says, "Thus saith the Lord, let my people go." And what do you think Pharaoh said? No. Who's the Lord? I am king. I am God on this earth. Who are you, Moses? But Pharaoh is not going to listen. So Moses then tells the people, he tells them, I have been sent from God to deliver you. Do you think the people were happy? They were very happy. They were very happy. Now we're going to be delivered. And so Moses goes back to Pharaoh, and this time he takes Aaron with him. And he says, "Thus saith the Lord, let my people go." And Pharaoh said, "Who is the Lord that I shall let the people go?" And so Pharaoh challenged Moses. And Moses had a staff, and he threw the staff on the floor, and appeared a snake. And then Pharaoh laughed. Pharaoh says, "My magicians can do the same." And so his magicians come, and they throw their rods, and appeared snakes. So Pharaoh wasn't impressed. The only difference is that the snake that came from Moses' hand ate up the snakes that came up from Pharaoh's hand. Yet Pharaoh was not impressed. And then Pharaoh also called the wise men and the sorcerers. Now the magicians of Egypt, they also did in like manner with their enchantments. For they cast down every man his rod, and they came serpents. But Aaron's rod swallowed up their rods. And by the way, today, do we have magicians and sorcerers? You only have to look at the films like Lord of the Rings, and you have people like Gandalf. But you only have to go to a health fair, and you see witches and sorcerers and all kinds of manners of spiritualism. And I tell you now today that we are living in a time, dangerous times. And Pharaoh was not impressed. In fact, Pharaoh said, "Ye are idle, you people." So he made the Jews, the slaves, work doubly hard, and he said, "Get your own straw. Let your God try and deliver you now." Do you think the Hebrew people were happy now? Not at all. In fact, they came to Moses and said, "You've made our life even harder. Who told you to come?" And so God had to teach them a lesson, and one by one there were plagues that came upon Egypt. Now the Egyptians, they had many gods. They worshipped frogs, they worshipped the river, they worshipped flies. So each of the plagues that came was demonstrating to the Egyptians that God was higher. So they worshipped frogs, he gave them frogs. And Pharaoh refused, so Egypt suffered what was called the 10 plagues. And the Egyptians shall know that I am the Lord, when I stretch forth mine hand upon Egypt, and bring out the children of Israel from among them. And these were the 10 plagues: water to blood, frogs, lice, flies, cattle, boils, hail, locusts, darkness, and the firstborn were slain. Now interestingly, the sorcerers were able to duplicate this one here. But eventually they had to admit that we don't have the power to replicate what Moses is doing. And they said, this is the finger of God. And Moses came to Pharaoh and said, "Let my people go." And so basically Pharaoh said, "Get out of my sight. I'm not going to listen to what you've got to say." And so God told Moses, "Do this thing. Take a lamb without blemish. Take the blood of this lamb and put it on the doorposts. Because the angel of death is going to come this night." And this is what was called the Passover. And this blood here was to represent the blood that Jesus was going to shed on that cross. And so they all got this blood, and they shall take of the blood and strike it on the 2 side posts and on the upper doorposts of the houses. But it's interesting. Remember yesterday, people thought Moses was crazy, didn't they? Remember? And what happened? Sorry, Noah. What happened? Finally, Noah gives the final invitation. He says, come onto the ark. And they refused. They thought he was crazy. And the same thing. What are these crazy people doing? Wasting the good sheep, wasting all that blood. And they laughed. But, interestingly enough, this opportunity to put this blood on the doorpost was open to the Egyptians. But they refused. And so they all obeyed and listened. And then they celebrated the Passover. And that night the angel of death came and struck every single house that did not have the blood on that doorpost, and the firstborn were killed. And that night was a night of weeping. And it came to pass that at midnight the Lord smote all the firstborn of Egypt, from the firstborn of Pharaoh that sat on the throne unto the firstborn of the captive that was in the dungeon, and all the firstborn of the cattle. And Pharaoh rose up that night, he and all his servants and all the Egyptians, and there was a great cry in Egypt, for there was not a house where was not one dead. And interestingly, as each of these plagues came into Egypt, there was one area where none of the plagues hit upon, and that was the area where the Jews were. And so Pharaoh that night, he said, these people make me sick. Let them get out of Egypt. Pharaoh finally lets the children of Israel go and leave the land of Egypt. And Pharaoh called for Moses and Aaron by night and said, rise up and get you forth from among my people, both you and the children of Israel, and go serve the Lord as you have said. And the children of Israel journeyed from Ramesses to Succoth, about 600,000 on foot, that were men, beside children. And a mixed multitude went up also with them, and flocks and herds, then even very much cattle. Some estimate about 2 million people when you add all the children and all the women and the mixed multitude. 2 million people.